Hey everybody, I just wanted to do a follow-up video to the video I did last night about the Queen of Sheba, the Ark, and the real Solomon. I wanted to talk a little bit today about Axum, Ethiopia, and I believe, as I stated last night, this is where the strongest tradition of where the Ark might be held today, if one still exists. I think there was more than one. In fact, in the Bible it calls for a building of a second Ark. A lot of people kind of overlook that, but I don't believe this was a singular box or ark. I believe there was a few of them made. I believe it was just an ancient lost technology. And this story from Axum, Ethiopia is very fascinating, I believe, and I just want to zoom in here. But as I stated last night, the story from the Bible and ancient Ethiopian text of the Queen of Sheba going to Jerusalem, hooking up with King Solomon and having a son named Menelik, and he stole the ark and brought it back to Axum, Ethiopia. And I told you that real history, if you go by archaeological and ancient texts that actually exist, it is the story of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. And Akhenaten took artifacts from Egypt, and his mother was Queen Taye, and she was the queen of Ethiopia, Nubia, and I directly associated her with Axum, and maybe Akhenaten brought the ark back here, and ancient text and lore tells of this. But this is the reason why I associated the Queen of Sheba with Axum. Here are the remains of her palace, supposedly. And this is the city of Axum. There's a lot of very ancient things in this town. There are obelisks and churches. And down here we have the Church of St. Mary of Zion, which supposedly is holding the Ark of the Covenant. And when I first heard this story, I rolled my eyes. I said, well, that's ludicrous. But the more I looked into this, I read the sign and the seal. There's just too many stories or facts relating to this site that you just can't dismiss this as being totally untrue. I don't believe it 100%, but there's no way I can dismiss it based on what I've read. There is some fascinating tales coming out of Axum, and I just want to tell you a few of them. Number one is Graham Hancock visited this site, and he's going to talk a little bit at the end of this, but these monks, that it was their sole life's duty to guard the Ark of the Covenant. They lived out the rest of their lives in this church, the St. Mary of Zion, and it was their only duty in life is to guard the Ark of the Covenant. And Graham Hancock visited a few of these monks that were in charge of guarding the Ark, and he said they all developed the same strange eye cataract. And that was just a very weird story. And also, there is a story coming out of Ethiopian myth and legend, or however you want to view it, that not many people know about. And in the late 1800s, they took on a much more powerful, mighty Italian army in a battle and utterly annihilated them, and they credited their victory to having the Ark of the Covenant. And, it was the largest or the biggest victory of an African army over a European army to that date. So that is a story not many people know about, and I just find it fascinating. And I've really tried to dig into that story, but there's not much to read on it. But anyway, I just think this site in Ethiopia is fascinating. I find it very impressive that this tradition has lasted as long as it has, that they actually have the Ark. And it's not a boasting, hey, look what we've got. It's just a quiet confidence that, hey, we've got the Ark and we're guarding it. And I just find that all fascinating. The Ark has been the subject of many stories and myths, and even the subject in movies. Of course, Raiders of the Lost Ark. It had the Nazis searching for the Ark of the Covenant, and people say, yeah, well, that was a entertaining movie, blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, the Nazis and the Italians, Mussolini's army, were looking for the Ark of the Covenant. And Mussolini's troops marched into Axum in 1937 or 9, I believe, and they were looking directly for the Ark of the Covenant. Why else would an Italian army have, I mean, and this was much smaller back then, but what business would they have of marching into this tiny little town in Ethiopia, the mighty Italian army? But direct local myth says, or ancient stories say, that they got wind of this invasion and they took the ark away through tunnels so it wouldn't be taken. But I just find that a very fascinating story. Mussolini's army took an obelisk for Axum, and I'm just going to read this story right here. Just a little bit of it. It says, the first piece of a huge 1,700-year-old granite obelisk was returned home from Italy to Ethiopia yesterday, 68 years after it was looted by the troops of the fascist Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. The 58-ton middle section of the funeral stone was returned from Rome to the northern Ethiopian town of Axum at sunrise in a cargo plane and was greeted by Ethiopians chanting and praying and weeping with joy. So, the story of the Nazis and the Italians looking for the Ark of the Covenant is very much a true story, and they knew it was in Axum. And maybe it's because of this battle that the Ethiopians had with the Italian army in the late 1800s, and maybe that was part of the reason that Mussolini knew it was in Axum. That's just a possibility, but I find it fascinating. Do I believe the Ark is there 100%? Absolutely not. Could it be there? I think absolutely. So I just hope you thought this was interesting. I'm going to have Graham Hancock talk at the end of the video here. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a nice day.
And on one journey to Ethiopia, I flew into a city that at the time was in the middle of a war zone, in a DC-3 that kind of dived down out of the sky to avoid the machine gun nests in the surrounding hills, and landed in the airport. And this was an ancient city called Axum, and it had incredible history. It had obelisks, it had a palace supposedly of the Queen of Sheba, had an ancient cathedral, the most ancient Christian cathedral in Africa, dating back to 300 after Christ. And in the grounds of that cathedral, in a chapel, outside the chapel, I meet a monk, and he tells me in the conversation we have that he's got the Ark of the Covenant in that chapel. I had heard that the Ark of the Covenant was important to Ethiopia, but now I'm sitting in front of a monk with cataracts in his eyes, and he's telling me behind him in that chapel, but I can't go there, is the Ark of the Covenant. And I said, can I go? Can I see it? And he said, no, nobody can see it. Even the former emperors were never allowed to see the Ark of the Covenant. The Raiders of the Lost Ark movie had come out only like a couple of years before this. This was in the early 80s. And so I left that place impressed by this man, but not really believing it. And then I started to look into it. And I discovered that actually Ethiopia is the only country in the world which has a living veneration, almost worship, of the Ark of the Covenant. Ethiopia has ancient Christianity, but it also has ancient Judaism. There's the Jewish community in Ethiopia called the Falashas. They call themselves the Beta Israel. How did they get there? They practice a very ancient form of Judaism. They don't have rabbis, they have priests. They perform sacrifice. Other Judaic peoples do not. It's like an Old Testament world frozen in the highlands of Ethiopia. So I started to get interesting. This is weird, and this is exciting, and what can I find out about this? Then I went to the academics, and they said, it's all rubbish. Those Ethiopians, they just made it up to make themselves look big. Okay, but then why is it the case that in every single church in Ethiopia, more than 20,000 churches, there's a replica of the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies?
What does it look like?
Well, mostly it's a box, and sometimes actually they reduce the replica to simply 2 tablets, which are supposed to represent the tablets of stone inside the Ark of the Covenant. But the Ark of the Covenant is not a Christian object, it's a pre-Christian object. What's it doing in all these churches? Where does this all come from? Why do we have the black Jews of Ethiopia practicing their very ancient form of Judaism? So I really started to dig, and it was the first time I realized that you don't want to listen to academics all the time. Professor X and Dr. Y may be very, very impressive people with their credentials, but they have prejudices, they have a fixed view of the past, which they're going to stick to come what may. And as I started to investigate this is what drew me out of current affairs and into ancient mysteries. I found that here was a real investigation, a story that had never been told. Could this remote country in the Horn of Africa really have the Ark of the Covenant? And if so, how could it have got there? And I spent several years of my life trying to answer those questions. And by the time I got to the end of that investigation, I had left current affairs behind, and
you were hooked.
I was hooked on the past.
Well, did you ever wonder if you were going crazy? Like, here I am really investigating if some people in Ethiopia actually have some crazy thing from a book
No,
that makes no sense.
I never
You really thought it was real?
It wasn't that I thought it was real. I neither thought nor didn't think that. I was impressed by the Ethiopians themselves, and I was impressed by the purity of their belief and the passion with which they held it, and the fact that here, after thousands of years, this object disappeared from the Bible at the time, around about 650 years before Christ. It's not mentioned again in the Bible after that, it vanishes. And yet here is its worship in 20th century Ethiopia today. How do we explain this? And it was, and as I dug deeper, I began to realize that actually there was a real possibility they did have the Ark of the Covenant, and that it is connected to the mystery of the Ethiopian Jews, and that the story they themselves tell about it, which connects it, it's a very romantic and lovely story. They say, in brief, that the Queen of Sheba, famous Queen of Sheba, was an Ethiopian queen, and that when she traveled to Jerusalem to meet Solomon, which is described in the Bible, big episode in the Bible, she didn't only exchange wisdom with him, she also exchanged bodily fluids, and she became pregnant with King Solomon's son, who was to be called Menelik, which actually means the son of the wise man. And pregnant, she left Jerusalem, returned to Ethiopia, gave birth to her son Menelik there. At the age of 20 or 21, he wanted to visit his famous father in Jerusalem. He traveled north, went to Jerusalem, spent a year there, and at the end of the year contrived to steal the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem and take it off to Ethiopia, and there it's been ever since. That's the Ethiopian story. I believe behind that legend there's a true history of how it really got there, and that's in the end what I ended up writing my first book of historical mysteries about, which was The Sign of the Seal.